The absent old lady. That was the name they gave me at my own granddaughter's wedding. By the end of that evening, not a single person in that ballroom was laughing anymore. I arrived at the Grand Willow Hotel just before 4 o'clock on a warm Saturday afternoon in June. The valet opened my car door, and for a moment I simply sat there, looking at the elegant white roses lining the entrance. My granddaughter Olivia was getting married today. I had imagined this day for years. I smoothed the fabric of my navy blue dress, the one my late husband Thomas always said brought out the color of my eyes. At 69 years old, I no longer cared much about fashion, but this day mattered. Olivia mattered. I picked up the silver-wrapped gift resting on the passenger seat and stepped out into the sunshine. The ballroom buzzed with excitement. Guests in formal attire drifted across polished marble floors. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. A string quartet played softly somewhere beyond the lobby. Everything looked exactly as a young bride would dream it should. As I approached the registration table, a smiling young woman handed me a welcome envelope and a name tag attached to a gold ribbon. "Welcome, ma'am," she said cheerfully. "We're so glad you could make it." I smiled back and glanced down at the card in my hand. My smile froze. Printed in elegant black lettering were 4 words: "The absent old lady." For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Surely there had been a mistake. I turned the card over. Nothing.
No explanación. No querexchen.
Just those 4 words staring back at me. The young woman was already helping another guest and seemed unaware of what was written there. I looked around the lobby. Families laughed together. Cameras flashed. Champagne glasses clinked. Nobody seemed to notice the strange weight suddenly pressing against my chest. I could have walked back to the table. I could have demanded an explanation. Instead, I pinned the tag to my dress. Then I walked into the ballroom. Years of experience had taught me something important. Sometimes the truth reveals itself when you remain silent long enough to hear what others are saying.
My assigned
table sat near the back of the room. As I made my way through the crowd, I noticed a few puzzled glances directed toward my name tag. One woman tilted her head as she read it. Another exchanged a quick look with her husband. I pretended not to notice. Near the dance floor, I spotted my son Daniel speaking with several guests. Beside him stood his wife, Vanessa. She looked flawless, wearing an expensive emerald green gown and a smile polished enough for a magazine cover. For a brief moment our eyes met across the room. Something flickered in her expression. Not surprise. Not confusion. Recognition. Then she looked away. That was when I knew the name tag was not a mistake. Somewhere inside me, a quiet certainty settled into place. Vanessa knew. Perhaps she had always known. I found my seat and carefully placed Olivia's wedding gift beside my chair. Around me, conversations floated through the air. Most were harmless. Some were not. I heard she was never around much, a woman whispered from the next table. Really? Another replied. That's what Vanessa said. I kept my eyes fixed on the floral centerpiece in front of me. White lilies, pale roses, silver ribbon, beautiful things arranged to distract from something unpleasant underneath. I suddenly wondered how many stories had been told about me when I was not in the room. How many versions of me existed inside the minds of these strangers? And most importantly, who had written those stories? As the lights dimmed and guests began taking their seats for the ceremony, I folded my hands in my lap and looked toward the aisle where Olivia would soon appear. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Instead, I had the feeling that before the night was over, a very different story was going to unfold. The ceremony began a few minutes later, and for a while the room seemed determined to maintain the illusion that everything was perfect. Soft music filled the ballroom as guests turned toward the aisle. Olivia appeared at the entrance beside her father, radiant in a flowing ivory gown. A collective sigh moved through the crowd. Cameras lifted. Smiles widened. Even I felt my eyes sting slightly as I watched my granddaughter take those careful first steps toward the future she had imagined for herself. For a few precious moments, I allowed myself to focus only on her happiness. Whatever confusion or humiliation I had experienced earlier, this day belonged to Olivia. She deserved to be celebrated. Yet even as I watched her walk down the aisle, a question lingered in the back of my mind. How had things reached this point? How had I become a stranger in a story I helped build? After the ceremony concluded and guests moved into the reception portion of the evening, servers began circulating with trays of sparkling drinks and appetizers. The atmosphere grew louder, warmer, more relaxed. People gathered in small circles, laughing and sharing memories. I remained seated for a while, observing. Over the years, I had learned that people often revealed more than they intended when they believed nobody important was listening. Across the room, I spotted Olivia greeting guests near the sweetheart table. She looked genuinely happy. That mattered. What unsettled me was how little she had spoken to me during the months leading up to the wedding. There had been no invitations to dress fittings. No phone calls asking for advice. No quiet conversations the way we used to have when she was younger. At the time, I had assumed she was simply busy. Weddings have a way of consuming every available hour. Now I was beginning to wonder whether something else had been happening. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. 2 years earlier, Olivia had called me late one evening after a difficult week at work. We had talked for nearly 3 hours. She had cried, laughed, and confessed fears she would never share publicly. Back then, she called me her safe place. Somewhere between that night and this wedding, a distance had quietly appeared between us. I had noticed it but never questioned it deeply. Perhaps I should have. A burst of laughter nearby pulled me back to the present. 2 women standing beside one of the cocktail tables were speaking softly. I had no intention of listening, but one sentence caught my attention immediately. Vanessa said Eleanor was never really involved. The second woman nodded. That is what I heard too. Apparently, she missed most family events. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not anger, not shock.
Calm.
Because suddenly the pieces were beginning to fit together. The name tag, the whispers, the curious looks. None of this had started today. It had been building for much longer. Someone had been creating a version of me that barely resembled reality. I thought about birthdays I had hosted, school plays I had attended, summers when Olivia stayed at my house for weeks at a time while her parents traveled, the countless mornings I drove her to piano lessons before work, the science fair project spread across my dining room table, the college applications we completed together. Entire chapters of our family history seemed to have vanished from the story others were now telling. As I sat quietly processing these thoughts, a server approached carrying a tray of champagne glasses. I accepted one and thanked him. The cool glass felt steady in my hand. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stood surrounded by guests. She appeared completely comfortable, smiling easily as conversations flowed around her. Then, for just a moment, her eyes found mine again. This time, she did not look away immediately. She simply held my gaze. There was confidence there. The confidence of someone who believed the narrative was already settled. Someone who believed everyone had accepted her version of events. I lifted my glass politely. She responded with a faint smile before turning back to her guests. And in that moment, I realized something important. If Vanessa had spent years rewriting the story of our family, then somewhere there had to be a reason. People rarely work that hard to erase someone unless that person stands in the way of something valuable. The reception moved forward with the effortless elegance that expensive weddings often project. Dinner service began. Waiters glided between tables carrying plates arranged with almost artistic precision. Soft conversations blended with music from the band. Anyone walking into the ballroom at that moment would have seen a celebration filled with happiness and family pride. What they would not have seen was the growing realization quietly taking shape inside me. I spent most of dinner listening rather than speaking. It was remarkable what people revealed when they believed they were discussing common knowledge. At the table beside mine, a gentleman I vaguely recognized from Daniel's business circle mentioned how fortunate Olivia was to have overcome such a difficult childhood relationship with her grandmother. His wife nodded sympathetically. Another guest remarked that it was admirable Olivia had invited me at all after years of distance. None of them sounded cruel. That was what made it worse. They genuinely believed the stories they had heard. Somewhere along the way, fiction had become accepted history. I carefully set down my fork and looked around the room. Nearly 200 guests filled the ballroom. Most of them had never met me before tonight. Their understanding of who I was had been handed to them by someone else. Someone they trusted. Someone close to the bride. Across the room, Olivia laughed at something one of her bridesmaids said. Watching her, I remembered the summer she turned 10 years old. Her parents had spent nearly 3 weeks traveling overseas. Olivia stayed with me the entire time. We baked blueberry pies together. We planted flowers in the backyard. Every evening we sat on the porch swing and watched the sunset while she told me stories about school and her dreams for the future. She once told me she wished she could live next door forever. The memory felt painfully distant now. As dessert was served, I excused myself from the table and stepped into a quieter hallway outside the ballroom. The sudden silence felt almost startling after hours of conversation. Framed wedding photographs from previous events lined the walls. I walked slowly, giving myself a moment to think. That was when I noticed a familiar voice behind me. Eleanor. I turned and immediately recognized Martin Hale. Martin had been a close friend of my late husband for decades. He was 72 now, tall and silver-haired, with the same thoughtful expression I remembered. Martin, I said, genuinely pleased to see him. I had no idea you were invited. He smiled warmly. Before his expression shifted, his eyes dropped briefly toward the name tag attached to my dress. For a second, he looked confused, then concerned. I was hoping that was some kind of misunderstanding, he said quietly. Apparently not. I gave a small shrug. I have seen stranger things. Martin studied my face carefully. You are handling this better than most people would. I am trying to understand it before I react to it. His gaze lingered on the ballroom entrance behind me. That is probably wise. Something in his tone caught my attention immediately. Martin, I said, what do you know? He hesitated, not because he was unwilling to answer, because he was deciding how much to say. Over the past year, he finally said, I have attended several events where people repeated things about you that did not sound accurate. I felt my pulse slow rather than quicken. The confirmation was oddly calming. Such as, he sighed softly, that you were uninvolved with the family, that you rarely visited, that you preferred your own life over spending time with your grandchildren. I let out a quiet breath. Every accusation was the opposite of reality. Martin folded his arms. I never believed it. Anyone who knew Thomas knew how devoted you were to your family. We stood silently for a moment. Then he added something that made my attention sharpen completely. The strange thing is how consistent the stories were. The exact same details. The exact same examples. Almost as if they were coming from a single source. Neither of us needed to say the name out loud. We both knew who that source was likely to be. Before I could respond, the ballroom doors opened and guests began moving toward the dance floor for the evening's festivities. Martin glanced toward the crowd, then back at me. Be patient tonight, he said quietly. I have a feeling there is more going on here than you realize. As he walked away, I looked through the open doors at the celebration continuing inside. For the first time all evening, I was no longer wondering whether someone had deliberately erased me from the family story. I knew they had. The only question remaining was why. Back inside the ballroom, the first dances had begun. Guests gathered around the polished dance floor while Olivia and her new husband moved beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Applause followed every turn. Smiles filled the room. Yet after my conversation with Martin, I found myself watching something entirely different. I was watching patterns. Small moments. Tiny details that had once seemed harmless on their own, but now felt connected. The longer I sat there, the more memories returned. None of them had appeared suspicious when they first happened. In fact, most of them had seemed perfectly reasonable. 5 years earlier, Olivia had invited me to attend a college awards banquet. A week before the event, Vanessa called and explained that seating was extremely limited. She sounded apologetic. She insisted Olivia felt terrible about it. I stayed home that evening and watched an old movie instead. 2 days later, photos appeared online. There were empty seats visible at multiple tables. Another memory surfaced. Olivia's 21st birthday. Vanessa had assured me the celebration would be small and private. She suggested I take Olivia to lunch another day instead. Later I discovered more than 40 guests had attended the dinner. Again, I convinced myself there had been a misunderstanding. Then there was the family vacation to Cape Cod. Vanessa told me the rental house had reached maximum occupancy. Months afterward, Daniel accidentally mentioned how several bedrooms had remained unused the entire week. At the time, I had chosen not to dwell on it. Families become complicated. Feelings get hurt. I preferred peace over confrontation. Sitting in that ballroom, I realized something uncomfortable. Every road seemed to lead back to the same person. Vanessa had never openly argued with me. She had never shouted or created scenes. Her approach was far more subtle. She operated through omissions, quiet adjustments, careful edits, like someone slowly rewriting a book one page at a time until nobody remembered the original version. The dance ended and guests returned to their tables. As conversations resumed, I noticed a display near the entrance to the reception hall that I had somehow overlooked earlier. It was a large decorative arrangement featuring photographs from Olivia's life. Guests gathered around it, smiling as they examined pictures from childhood, high school, college, and engagement celebrations. Curious, I stood and walked toward it. The closer I got, the stranger I felt. There were dozens of photographs. Olivia at age 5. Olivia learning to ride a bicycle. Olivia opening Christmas presents. Olivia graduating from college. Olivia standing beside family members at birthdays and holidays. I studied each image carefully. My chest tightened. I was not in a single one of them.
Not one.
At first I thought it must be coincidence. Then I continued looking. The more photographs I examined, the more impossible the omission became. I had been present during many of those moments. In some cases, I had actually taken the photographs being displayed. Yet somehow every trace of my presence had vanished. A younger woman standing beside me pointed to one picture and smiled. "That one is adorable," she said. Her grandmother must not have been around much. The words were spoken casually, without malice. That was what made them hurt. I smiled politely and stepped away before she could recognize who I was. As I returned toward my table, I noticed Vanessa speaking with several guests near the bar. She looked completely relaxed, completely confident. For someone who had spent years shaping a narrative, tonight must have felt like a victory lap. The photographs, the whispers, the name tag. None of it was accidental. It was a coordinated story, a carefully constructed version of reality. But stories have one weakness. They depend on people never seeing the missing pages. And for the first time all evening, I had the distinct feeling that somewhere in this ballroom, one of those missing pages was about to surface. The evening continued unfolding with the polished rhythm of a carefully planned celebration, but I could no longer see it the way the other guests did. Every smile, every toast, every photograph seemed to exist on two levels. There was the version everyone could see, and then there was the version hidden beneath it. I returned to my table and sat quietly while coffee was served. Around me, conversations drifted from wedding stories to travel plans and family memories. Nobody paid much attention to the older woman sitting near the back of the room. That invisibility, I was beginning to realize, had become my greatest advantage. A few minutes later, someone gently touched my shoulder. I turned and found Olivia's college roommate, Megan, standing beside me. I recognized her immediately. She had spent countless weekends at my house during their freshman year. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said warmly, "it is so good to see you." Her smile seemed genuine, and for the first time all evening I felt a small sense of relief. "It is wonderful to see you too, Megan." She pulled out the chair beside me and lowered her voice slightly. "Can I ask you something?" There was hesitation in her tone. "Of course." She glanced toward the dance floor where Olivia and several friends were laughing together. "I always thought you and Olivia were extremely close." I felt my attention sharpen immediately. "We were." Megan frowned. "That is what confused me." She paused. "Over the last couple of years, I kept hearing people say you were distant and uninvolved. It never matched the person I remembered." I remained silent. Megan continued. When Olivia was struggling during college, she talked about you constantly. She called you whenever she had a problem. She used to tell people you were the strongest person she knew. Hearing those words felt like finding a photograph that had been lost for years.
Familiar.
Precious. Unexpected. Thank you for telling me that, I said quietly. Megan studied my expression. Something strange has been happening, has it not? Before I could answer, another guest approached her with a question, and she excused herself. Yet her brief conversation lingered in my mind long after she walked away. She had unknowingly confirmed something important. Not everyone believed the story that had been circulating. Some people remembered the truth. The challenge was that their voices had been drowned out by a louder narrative. As I sat there reflecting on that realization, I noticed a leather-bound book displayed near the gift table. Several guests were taking turns writing messages for the newlyweds. Curious, I walked over and opened it. The first pages contained photographs and memories submitted by family and friends. I turned each page slowly. There were messages from cousins, neighbors, coworkers, childhood friends, and distant relatives. Entire pages were dedicated to people who had known Olivia for only a few years. Then I reached a section titled "The People Who Shaped My Journey." My eyes moved across the names.
Teachers.
Coaches. Family friends. Vanessa's relatives.
Daniel's colleagues.
The page continued. My name was nowhere to be found. I checked again. Then a third time. Nothing. A strange calm settled over me. Earlier that evening I might have felt hurt. Now I felt something else.
Clarity.
This was no longer a collection of isolated incidents. It was a deliberate pattern repeated over years. Remove the photographs. Remove the stories. Remove the memories. Remove the name. Eventually people begin to believe the person was never there at all. As I closed the book, I noticed an envelope partially visible beneath the display table. It appeared to have slipped behind one of the decorative arrangements. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something about it caught my attention. The handwriting on the front looked familiar. Very familiar. I carefully reached down and picked it up. The envelope was addressed to Olivia. In the upper left corner was a name I recognized immediately.
Martin Hale.
My pulse slowed. Not from fear. From instinct. Whatever Martin had placed inside that envelope, he had intended Olivia to see it tonight. And judging by the way it had been hidden beneath the display table instead of delivered directly, someone else may have wanted to make certain she never did. For several seconds I stood completely still, holding the envelope in my hands while the sounds of celebration continued around me. Laughter drifted across the ballroom. Glasses clinked. Music floated through the air. Yet all of it seemed distant. The envelope itself was ordinary. Cream-colored paper. Neat handwriting. Nothing about it appeared dramatic. And yet something
Told me it mattered.
I glanced around the room. Nobody seemed to be paying attention. Carefully, I slipped the envelope into my purse. If Martin had wanted Olivia to receive it, I would make certain she did. The question was why someone had apparently gone to such effort to prevent that from happening. A few minutes later, I spotted Martin standing near one of the side exits, speaking with an older couple. When their conversation ended, I approached him quietly. His eyes immediately dropped to my purse. Then he looked back at me. "You found it," he said. It was not a question. I did. For the first time that evening, genuine concern appeared on his face. Where? Hidden beneath the display table near the guest book. Martin exhaled slowly. That confirms my suspicion. Which is? He glanced around before lowering his voice. I delivered that envelope personally to the wedding coordinator this afternoon. She assured me it would be placed with Olivia's gifts before the reception began. I felt my stomach tighten, and instead it ended up hidden beneath a table. Martin nodded. Apparently, we stood in silence for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been forming since I found it. What is inside? Martin studied me carefully. Information Olivia deserves to know. That answer only deepened my curiosity. About what? About the wedding. His response was immediate. And about who made it possible. Before I could press further, someone called his name from across the room. Martin hesitated. The envelope belongs to Olivia. She should be the first person to read it. Then he walked away. I remained standing near the ballroom entrance, my thoughts racing. About who made it possible. The words echoed in my mind. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. 6 months earlier, Olivia had mentioned concerns about wedding costs during a phone call. She sounded overwhelmed. Venues, catering, flowers, photography. Everything seemed more expensive than expected. A week later, she called again. Strangely, all those concerns had disappeared. She told me everything was under control. At the time, I assumed Daniel and Vanessa had stepped in financially. Now, I was no longer certain. Back at my table, I watched guests move between conversations and dance numbers. Then something unexpected happened. 2 members of the catering staff wheeled out a large decorative board displaying acknowledgments for contributors and sponsors. Similar displays are common at charity galas and large private events. Guests wandered over to read the names. Curious, I joined them. The list included florists, event planners, photographers, and several family members being thanked for their support. Vanessa's name appeared prominently near the top. Daniel's name followed directly beneath it. I scanned the entire board once. Then again. My name was nowhere to be found, not even in the smallest print. Yet as I stared at the display, another realization settled over me. The omission itself felt almost desperate. As though someone had become so committed to erasing my presence that they could no longer distinguish between truth and fiction. Nearby, I overheard one of the event coordinators speaking to a colleague. The anonymous donor was incredibly generous, she said. Without that contribution, they would have had to cut half the reception budget. The other coordinator nodded. I still cannot believe they wanted to remain completely private. My attention sharpened instantly. Anonymous donor. Significant contribution. Wedding budget. I looked toward the lavish ballroom surrounding us. The towering floral arrangements. The live band. The custom lighting. None of it had come cheaply. And for the first time all evening, a possibility entered my mind that seemed almost impossible. What if the missing page Martin mentioned was not simply about family memories? What if someone had been hiding something much larger than that? What if the story being rewritten was not only about who loved Olivia, but also about who had quietly made this entire celebration possible in the first place? The possibility refused to leave my mind. For years, I had dismissed uncomfortable questions in favor of keeping peace within the family. Tonight, however, every new detail seemed connected to the one before it. The missing photographs, the altered stories, the hidden envelope, the anonymous donor. None of it felt random anymore. The band began playing a slower selection as guests returned to the dance floor. Servers cleared dessert plates and refreshed drinks. The reception was moving into the portion of the evening where emotions softened and formalities gradually disappeared. It was also the point when people became less careful about what they said. I remained at my table, quietly observing. A few minutes later, I noticed the wedding coordinator speaking with Vanessa near the entrance. Their conversation appeared tense, not dramatic, just unusually serious for a celebration. Vanessa listened, nodded sharply, then glanced around the ballroom. For a brief moment her eyes landed on me. Something in her expression changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Concern. The coordinator handed her a small folder before walking away. Vanessa immediately opened it. Her eyes moved quickly across the contents. Then she closed it and forced a smile as another guest approached. I had spent enough years raising a family to recognize when someone was pretending everything was fine. Whatever she had just learned, she did not like it. The realization settled quietly in my thoughts. Somewhere behind the scenes, something was beginning to shift. Not long afterward, Daniel approached my table. It was the first meaningful interaction we had shared all evening. "Mom," he said, offering a polite smile. "Are you enjoying yourself?" The question sounded rehearsed. Not cruel, just distant. "It has certainly been memorable," I replied. He glanced briefly at the name tag attached to my dress before looking away. The movement was small, but I noticed it. "I am sorry we have not had much time to talk tonight," he said. "There has been so much going on." "I understand." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked a simple question. "Daniel, who paid for this wedding?" His eyebrows lifted slightly. Clearly, he had not expected that topic. What do you mean? It is a beautiful event, I said calmly. I was just wondering how everything came together. He hesitated, just for a second. Then he smiled. A lot of people helped. It was not an answer.
It was an
escape. Before I could ask another question, someone called his name from across the room. He excused himself and disappeared back into the crowd. I watched him go. Years ago, Daniel would have answered immediately. Tonight, he looked like a man carefully avoiding a conversation. Across the ballroom, the master of ceremonies stepped onto a small platform and tapped the microphone. The room gradually quieted. Guests returned to their seats. Glasses were set down. Conversations faded. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced warmly, we are about to begin our special acknowledgments and family toasts. Applause filled the room. The program moved forward exactly as planned. Parents were thanked. Friends were recognized. Members of the wedding party received warm praise. Several individuals were invited to share brief remarks about the newlyweds. As each name was called, people smiled and stood. Yet one thing became increasingly obvious. Entire branches of family history were being discussed, while my existence remained carefully unmentioned. Not once did anyone reference the years I spent helping raise Olivia. Not once did anyone mention the countless moments we had shared. It was as though I had been edited out of a film while everyone pretended the missing scenes had never existed. Then the master of ceremonies looked down at his notes and smiled. Before we continue, he said, there is one final acknowledgement that was requested for tonight. I noticed Vanessa immediately straighten in her chair. Several guests turned toward the stage. The room grew quiet again. The master of ceremonies lifted a sealed envelope. This concerns a private contribution that played a significant role in making this celebration possible. The words seemed to freeze the air around me. Across the ballroom, Vanessa's smile disappeared completely. The ballroom fell completely silent. Even the band members lowered their instruments as the master of ceremonies unfolded the document inside the envelope. Hundreds of eyes focused on the stage. I could feel the tension spreading through the room like a change in weather. The master of ceremonies adjusted his glasses and smiled politely.
The
family requested that the identity of this contributor remain private until tonight, he said. However, the donor left a statement to be shared during the reception. I noticed Olivia glance toward Daniel with visible confusion. Daniel looked equally surprised. Only Vanessa appeared truly unsettled. Her hands remained perfectly still in her lap, but the confidence she had carried all evening was gone. The master of ceremonies began reading. To Olivia, I hope your wedding day is everything you dreamed it would be. Watching you grow into the woman you are today has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. Every dollar given toward this celebration was offered with love and with no expectation of recognition. A murmur moved through the crowd. The wording felt personal, deeply personal. Olivia leaned forward in her chair. This contribution was made anonymously because families should never feel like a transaction. Love is not something that should appear on invoices or guest lists. It should simply be given. The room remained silent. I could see guests exchanging curious glances. Then the master of ceremonies reached the final lines. Although I was advised that my involvement might complicate the planning process, I wanted Olivia to have the wedding she deserved. Therefore, I quietly provided the funds necessary to close the remaining budget gap. I asked for nothing in return except her happiness. With love always, Eleanor Whitmore. For several seconds, nobody reacted. It was as if the room needed time to process what had just happened. Then dozens of heads slowly turned toward me. Olivia's expression changed first. Confusion gave way to disbelief. Then disbelief gave way to something much deeper. I watched her eyes fill with emotion as she looked from the stage to me and then back again. The master of ceremonies continued speaking. The anonymous contribution covered approximately 70% of the final event costs. This time the reaction was immediate. Audible gasps spread across the ballroom. Conversations erupted in hushed whispers. People who had spent the evening believing one version of the story were suddenly confronted with another. Across The room, I noticed several guests looking directly at the name tag attached to my dress. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The woman labeled as absent had quietly made the celebration possible. Olivia slowly rose from her chair. "What?" she whispered. The microphone was not close enough to amplify her voice, but those seated nearby heard her clearly. Daniel looked stunned. He turned toward Vanessa, clearly searching for an explanation. Vanessa stared straight ahead without answering. Then another unexpected development occurred. The master of ceremonies lifted a second document from the envelope. "There is also a note from Martin Hale," he announced. My attention sharpened immediately. Mr. Hale requested that this be delivered to the bride tonight along with supporting records. He opened the document and continued reading. "Attached are copies of payment records confirming the source of the anonymous contribution, along with correspondence regarding several requests made during wedding planning." The room became quiet once again. These records indicate that multiple attempts were made to remove references to Eleanor Whitmore from family displays, acknowledgments, and commemorative materials despite her financial and personal support. No one moved. No one spoke. The truth was arriving not through anger or accusation, but through documentation, through facts, through records that could not be argued away. Olivia's eyes shifted slowly toward the family photo display near the entrance, then toward the guest book, then finally toward the name tag still pinned to my dress. Piece by piece, she was seeing the pattern that had remained hidden for years. And judging by the expressions spreading across the ballroom, she was not the only one. For a long moment, nobody in the ballroom seemed to know what to say. The silence felt heavier than any speech could have been. I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap, while the reality of the evening settled over the room. Across the dance floor, Olivia stood motionless. Her eyes moved from the documents in the master of ceremonies' hands to the photo display, then to me. I could almost see the memories returning to her. Not the edited versions she had been given, but the real ones. The afternoons spent baking cookies in my kitchen. The school recitals where I sat in the front row. The nights I stayed awake helping her finish projects that were due the next morning. The countless moments that had quietly disappeared from the story being told about our family. Slowly, Olivia walked toward me. The room remained silent as she crossed the ballroom. When she reached my table, she knelt beside my chair and took my hands. Tears filled her eyes. "Grandma," she whispered, "why did you never tell me?" I looked at her and saw the little girl she used to be. "Because love is not supposed to keep score," I said gently. "I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything." Her shoulders trembled slightly as she lowered her head. "I thought you stopped caring." The words hurt, but they also explained everything. Someone had not simply erased me. They had replaced me. Replaced years of love with years of carefully repeated misunderstandings. I squeezed her hands softly. "I never stopped caring, Olivia. Not for a single day." Around us, guests watched quietly. Nobody was interested in the music anymore. Nobody was paying attention to the decorations or the expensive centerpieces. The truth had become the center of the room. Daniel approached next. He looked older than he had a few hours earlier. Not in years, but in expression. He glanced at the documents and then at me. "Mom," he said quietly. I did not know. I believed him. That was perhaps the saddest part of all. He had allowed someone else to narrate our family for so long that he had stopped checking whether the story was true. "You should have asked," I replied calmly. He lowered his eyes. There was no argument. No defense. Only regret. Across the ballroom, Vanessa remained seated. For the first time all evening, she was completely alone. The conversations that had surrounded her earlier had disappeared. Nobody was confronting her. Nobody needed to. The documents had done what anger never could. They had allowed people to draw their own conclusions. Eventually, Olivia stood and turned toward the guests. Her voice shook slightly, but every word was clear. "I owe my grandmother an apology." The room listened. Not only for tonight, for years. She looked back at me. "I let other people tell me who you were instead of remembering it myself." No one interrupted. No one looked away. Some guests wiped tears from their eyes. Others simply sat quietly, reflecting on everything they had witnessed. The master of ceremonies stepped aside. The spotlight that had illuminated the stage now seemed unnecessary. The most important moment of the evening was happening right there among the guests. A little while later, the band began playing again. Conversations slowly returned. People smiled. Some approached my table to introduce themselves properly. Others shared memories they had heard about me over the years. But the greatest gift came when Olivia pulled an empty chair beside her table and asked me to sit next to her for the remainder of the reception. As I moved to join her, I removed the name tag from my dress and placed it quietly on the table. I looked at it one final time before setting it aside. Then I smiled, because the woman described on that card had never truly existed. The people who mattered finally knew that. And sometimes the most powerful response is not revenge, not anger, and not humiliation. Sometimes it is simply allowing the truth to walk into the room and speak for itself.